Good morning, friends, colleagues. Delighted to be here, speaking on behalf of the Department of Education at this important conference, Universal Design, a Licence to Learn. And I suppose in the title of it, we can reflect on a number of themes around inclusiveness, access, and in particular the role which the education system, in all its various parts, can play in supporting this agenda. When Anna asked me to open the conference, she brought me back almost just over a decade now, when I worked in the department of the Taoiseach. And one of the roles that I had related to social policy, social inclusion. And in that role, I chaired the interdepartmental group which developed the disability strategy. And looking this morning and yesterday at the Act, the 2005 Act, I was brought back, right back all those years, to the provisions in relation to the establishment of the Centre of Excellence in Universal Design, which was very innovative, I think, at that time, very relevant, and since the enactment and the establishment has proven to be a major part of the infrastructure that we've put in place in Ireland around disability and around access. So again, from 2015 back a decade, it's very interesting to see how policy which is made in one decade impacts in the next decade, and I know in decades to come. So in thinking about the conference, we in the Department of Education very much welcome the initiative which AHEAD have taken to put this conference together and to bring people into a room, into a space where they can discuss these really important issues. And we look forward to hearing about the conference deliberations, because it's in this way that we add to the overall sum of our knowledge and help us as policymakers, who, as you know, can sometimes be quite removed from the day-to-day reality of people's lives. It's conferences like this and it's conversations like the ones you will have today and tomorrow which are tremendously valuable to people like myself and people I work with in terms of policy development and implementation. And as Anne said, universal design, it's a work in progress, but it does seem to me, and it did seem to me all those years ago, that the concept at the heart of universal design in relation to making things accessible to everybody, and I remember pushing my children in buggies thinking we could do with a bit of universal design here. So if we can get that right, and if we can, at the heart of our design, very often it's about keeping it simple, doing it well. That gives us a basis then to mainstream good practice. So that's very much in tune with the objectives of a number of the department's policies, and in particular the forthcoming National Plan for Equity of Access to Higher Education, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also relevant to those working across all levels of education. And again, that's, I think, an important theme, that while we're very much focused, I think, today on the higher education piece of the jigsaw, the reality is that there is much more work that needs to be done across the continuum of education, from early years right through to lifelong learning. And that's an agenda that we in the department are taking very seriously and attempting to put together a set of policies and interlinkages across the various parts of the department. As you know, that's not an inconsiderable task. So the kinds of issues which will emerge at this conference, which are relevant to all parts of the education system, make it extremely rich and valuable. So let me talk for a minute about equity of access to higher education and how it's a national policy priority. As you know, equity of access to higher education for all citizens is a long-standing priority in policy terms for both the department and the HEA. It's in the interests of both economic and social inclusion to ensure that equity of access and participation is a reality for all citizens to develop their potential skills and abilities through further and higher education. And at the core of this policy agenda is the belief that we cannot afford to leave anyone behind, and I know that that would be shared by everybody in the audience today. So this was the concept underpinning the work of the disability strategy, which I mentioned earlier, and which the legislation was passed in 2005. 2005 is actually a really important year. As I say, we had the disability strategy and the launch of the disability strategy in that year. And since then, there have been 2 national plans for equity of access to higher education, the aim of which have been to target increased access and participation by groups that were underrepresented in the sector, including people with disabilities. So all part of a whole of government approach to inclusion. I think that's a very important perspective to take on this work. So we've had, as I say, 2 national plans for equity of access, and in each successive plan, targets for increased participation by people with disabilities have been set. And the good news, and it is good news, is that for the most part, these have been exceeded. And sometimes we can not meet targets or something happens, but I think it's really good that when we work together, particularly in this area, we've been actually very successful. So in terms of policy in higher education, we have as our policy framework the National Strategy for Higher Education to 2030, which sets out a broad range of directions in Irish higher education. And we have moved the next step in implementing that strategy by putting in place a higher education system performance framework for 2014 to 2016. And the government has set out a number of objectives which it wants the higher education system to achieve. And it has, and again I think this is really important, it has placed equity of access to higher education as the second of 7 key system objectives. So it's right up there. And that's not just symbolic. It's actually in terms of managing a complex agenda. When something is right up at the top of the list, it does get a lot of attention. And I think there's ample evidence that a lot of effort has been put into the equity of access agenda in recent years and will also be placed in the years to come. So this is a very significant and positive development to push equity of access as a mainstay of the system. So how does that then get worked out in practice in the Irish context? Well, each of the individual higher education institutions, or HEIs, then agrees a performance compact with the HEA. So there's, if you like, a contract or a compact between the government and each HEI around what they can achieve in relation to the government's objectives for the system. So the compact includes the commitments that institutions make, both individually and working in clusters, to the achievement of objectives for access. So I think it's really important that for the first time we have a clear line of sight about what is happening in the system, who's doing what where are the resources going, and some metrics by which to measure achievement. And I wouldn't underestimate how important and what a big change that is in the management of a higher education system. I think Ireland is very much out in front, certainly in European terms, in developing this approach. So looking back, I would argue that there has been a positive outcome from the sustained focus on access in national policy. In particular, the outcomes so far demonstrate the value of national planning and the setting and monitoring of national targets. So, what has happened? Rates of participation by students with disabilities in higher education have, in overall terms, grown remarkably in the last 2 decades. A recent AHEAD report records how participation by students with disabilities in higher education has grown from less than 1,000 students in 1993, so 22 years ago, so 1,000 students. And in 2013, the number was nearly 10,000. I mean, that's, by any standards, by any benchmark, I think a phenomenal achievement. And it's an achievement, it's a collective achievement, because many people contributed to that development. The HEA survey estimates that 6% of entrants to higher education in 2013 were students with disabilities. So again, a really significant increase and improvement over preceding years. And it's all the more remarkable when you consider that in 2001, the Action Group on Access reported that less than 1% of entrants to HEA institutions were students with disabilities. So I think there are big lessons here to be learned in terms of implementation science, where targets for improvement were set both in the report and in successive national action plans, and that gave a basis to align and mobilise the achievements across the system. New targets to achieve further increases in participation will be set in the next National Access Plan, and my colleagues from the Department of the HEA are here. We're nearly there, and hope that plan will be published over the next little while. These targets will seek to increase both overall participation by people with disabilities in the sector, as well as by groups where higher levels of underrepresentation and barriers to progress remain, in particular for those with sensory and physical disabilities. So a lot more to do, we know, but we're building on a really strong foundation. I just want to talk briefly about the key factors which we believe have supported progress over that period. Firstly, the legislative framework, which I alluded to, has underpinned the evolution towards a rights-based environment for students at all levels of the education system, and that has been important. Secondly, disability advocacy and support organisations like AHEAD and the Disability Federation of Ireland have raised the profile of people with disabilities and showcased the benefits for all of more inclusive participation in the education, business, arts and other spheres of Irish life. Thirdly, within higher education, the tireless activity and advocacy of access and disability services and officers throughout the sector has enabled many cohorts of those with disabilities to enter higher education and ensure that they are supported to successfully complete their studies. Since 2009, the Disability Access Route to Education, the DARE scheme, operated by the higher education institutions supported by the HEA, has greatly increased the number of school leavers with disabilities entering higher education. And over a third of all students with disabilities now enter participating institutions via this scheme. So again, another important piece of infrastructure on which to build. The fund for students with disabilities has, since the early 90s, also been a crucial component in ensuring that resources are allocated to institutions to provide the necessary supports and assistance to students with disabilities to fully participate in and complete their courses. Finally, at second level, the National Council for Special Education and the Department are supporting an increasing number of students with special education needs. Thanks to increased resources in this area, there are over 20,000 students coming through the system. These young adults are achieving success at leaving certificate level and have an expectation and an entitlement to go on to further and higher education in order to fulfil their education ambitions and progress to the career of their choice. And as I mentioned earlier, collaboration between second level and higher education to improve transitions and pathways for learners has been a major theme in education policy over the last number of years. As part of the work, I'm aware of good examples of joined-up thinking and practice between higher education and second level around the area of assisted technology provision for students with sensory and physical disabilities. And indeed, I was talking to colleagues in my alma mater, the University of Limerick, about some of that before we started. The objective of this is practical but essential and has been to ensure that the necessary equipment and training are available to students and their teachers in second level to ensure a seamless transition for the student to further higher education. Work by clusters of higher education institutions with second level schools and other local partners will be an opportunity to advance similar models, and the department will be very anxious that this will happen and will support activity in this area. These types of collaborations align with the more integrated policy on social inclusion from preschool on to higher education, work on which is we are working on those policies. So, equity of participation and outcome. There's been a much stronger emphasis in recent national policy discourse on the importance of equity of outcome as well as access for students. The focus is on the quality of the student experience, including that of students with disabilities, with a view to how this can be both assured and strengthened. The monitoring of the experience of students through both local and national surveys is a vital barometer, including the recent innovation of the Irish Survey of Student Engagement, which is our flagship by which we engage with students and seek their views on the system. It's a really, really important initiative which has been taken. and led by the HEA. So monitoring of data on rates of progression and retention, levels of performance, and labour market destinations, further study pathways are essential to gauging outcomes for different groups. And again, we're putting systems in place to allow us to do this. I want to mention briefly and just refer to the work of the National Forum on Teaching and Learning, which I think is another really important part of the infrastructure in higher education strategy. The Forum are undertaking research at the moment on the reasons for non-completion in higher education and on the provision of more effective supports for students transitioning into, within and out of higher education. So again, and I know this is of concern to people in the room, we need to understand better the reasons for not successful transitions or progression or completion. So we're trying to look at that in a very structured way. And we believe that all of this research will enable the development of more effective supports for students, including those with disabilities. There are new initiatives going into place, such as student mentoring schemes and increased mainstreaming of student supports in higher education institutions, and they'll be emphasised in the new National Access Plan. They'll increase the engagement of all students with the educational institution. We're also looking at employment outcomes for students with disabilities. They've been transformed in recent years, and we will have more systematic monitoring of labour market and other outcomes for graduates with disabilities, and we'll be exploring this as part of our higher education data strategy. The AHEAD Willing Able Mentoring WAM work placement programme is bringing together employers and graduates with disabilities in ways which allow a genuine learning experience for all partners, and I think that's been a really successful programme. On a global level, the principles of universal design are used in some of the most innovative workplaces in the world to ensure that they can attract and retain the brightest employees, and I think there's lessons in there for us. So, I want to say a word about moving from reasonable accommodation to universal design. National policy in the next National Access Plan will set targets to achieve further increases in access by students with disabilities, so that will be our policy foundation. But this will create its own challenges for our institutions. Putting in place supports and accommodations for students with disabilities is a legal requirement. This is where the principles of universal design can be used most effectively to support those with disabilities, and this can go well beyond reasonable accommodation. So, instead of adaptations of traditional systems and accommodations that label those accessing them as different, the tools are developing to rewrite the rulebook and create a teaching and learning framework that can be accessed by all users on an equal base. And I think that's a very powerful vision. And one in which I think we will all be striving. So we believe in the department that the principles of universal design are as applicable to the design of a curriculum or course as they are to a physical environment. Examples of best practice are emerging throughout the Irish further and higher education sector. We want to disseminate this best practice, and we very much welcome the conference, which will help researchers and practitioners to share these ideas and to move them into the policy sphere. I think it's very clear that we need to innovate in order to meet the needs of students with disabilities in the further and higher education sectors and those coming through from second level. The application of universal design has the potential to create a system that, from student induction, course design, teaching and learning methods and supports, and physical accessibility, is open to everyone and allows everyone's talents and abilities to flourish. So in conclusion, I would like to reiterate the strong support of the department for the theme of today's conference. The discussions and debate that will occur here today will contribute to the sum of our knowledge, and I look forward to hearing from the keynote speakers and national and international experts. We recognise, and I think we should recognise, that we've come a long way, but we also have a long way to go in addressing the issue of universal design. And I hope that the experience gained globally and presented at the conference will give us an insight as to how it might be successfully applied in the further and higher education sectors. And finally, I would like to thank Anne and colleagues in AHEAD for bringing us together today, for their dedication over the years of advocates for students with disabilities, their continued commitment to highlighting and building on progress, and for raising the collective awareness of those of us working in education, as well as the general public, on where further change is needed. And I wish Anne and AHEAD every success, both today and in the future. Thank you very much indeed.